Alrighty. Well, we are in the second to last lesson from this curriculum on Genesis, and what a great part of Scripture is the story of Joseph and all that happened to him. And so, as we get into chapter 45, there's this huge context, right? That they can't cover everything. So you really have to kind of, in your understanding the context section, the context really they're looking at is from chapter 42 all the way through chapter 46. So even though the lessons on chapter 45, 1 through 15, you got some stuff there that you can't talk about it all. You can't read all those scriptures. I think the understanding the context section in your leader guide does a pretty good job of summarizing it. I hate to just read stuff when I'm teaching, but you just might want to kind of summarize that or read over it. Um, I'm just going to add a couple things that I think are important. In chapter 41, verse 57, it tells us that the famine was far reaching. The verse uses all the earth. Let me go ahead and read that verse, chapter 41, verse 57. The people of all the earth came to Egypt. And, I don't really know how to understand that. Is that hyperbole, or is that just kind of using that terminology for the known earth around the known population? If it was more, hadn't really spread out too far beyond, the Middle Eastern area where basically civilization started. But the bottom line is this is not some local famine just in Egypt and a little bit of surrounding. This is a huge severity of a worldwide problem. And that, is really what Joseph's dream showed you when it talked about the lean cows ate the fat cows and they still ended up being lean. So I wish I could do that trick with my food. But, anyways, so Joseph's brothers arrive in chapter 42 to buy grain, and they bow to Joseph in chapter 42, verse 6, in fulfillment of chapter 37, verse 8, when they first heard Joseph's dream and mocked and said, "Well, you rule over us." Well, yes, he's ruling over them. And they also, to emphasize the point, are described in chapter 43, verse 28, as bowing again. Now, as far as context goes, I think chapter 42, verse 11 through 15 is very important. I would read those verses. And let me go ahead, and I'm going to go ahead and read them this morning. 42, 11 through 15 says, "We are all sons of one man. We are honest men." These are Joseph's brothers talking, okay? The ones who wanted to kill him and ended up selling him, threw him in a pit, then sold him to the Ishmaelites, and then lied to their father about Joseph being killed, saying, "We are honest men." Keep that in mind. Verse 12, "Yet he said to them, 'No, but you have come to look at the undefended parts of our land.' But they said, 'Your servants are 12 brothers in all, the sons of one man, the land of Canaan. And behold, the youngest is with our father today, and one is no longer alive.' And Joseph said to them, 'It is as I said to you, you are spies. By this you will be tested. By the life of Pharaoh, you shall not go from this place unless your youngest brother comes here.'" So I read this passage because I think it's very important to understand that what might be considered the weird things Joseph does, not only here, calling them spies, but then making Simeon stay, then doing the whole issue with their putting their money back in their sacks. So it looks like they get home and realize, "Hey, how's our money here?" So they feel like, they almost can't go back because they'll be accused of stealing, and then later putting the silver cup in Benjamin's sack and all that stuff. It isn't Joseph being vengeful. It isn't Joseph trying to toy with them. Uh, maybe he's toying with them a little bit, but he really is trying to test them to see if they've changed. That's one thing that he's doing in chapter 42, verse 11. I think, they claim to be honest men. And so he's going to see, have they changed? Chapter 44, for example, verse 7 says, "They said to him, 'Why does my Lord speak such words as these? Far be it from your servants to do such a thing.'" So they keep claiming their innocence, which in this sense they were innocent, but Joseph's testing them. I think he's also trying to help bring to their mind their guilt of what they'd done. Chapter 42, verse 21 says, Then they said to one another, Truly we are guilty concerning our brother, because we saw the distress of his soul when he pleaded with us, yet we would not listen. Therefore this distress has come upon us. Do you see what they're referring to there? Remember when they threw Joseph into the pit and then they sat down and ate a meal? This verse seems to be referring back to that they saw the distress of his soul when he pleaded with them and we did nothing. So they're feeling guilty about what they had done. And I think that was all part of what Joseph is trying to do here, is to bring these things back to their remembrance as they're proclaiming their goodness and demonstrating, kind of getting their mind to remember all that they had done. And then ultimately, a very practical purpose of all this was to make them bring Benjamin back. He wants all his brothers there. He eventually, of course, wants his father there. But as far as he's probably conjuring up this plan to reveal himself to them, he wants Benjamin to be there. So how old is Joseph? Page 134 says that Joseph is 39 at this time, because chapter 41, verse 46 says he was 30 when he began serving Pharaoh, and then there were 7 years of plenty. And then our text tells us here that they're 2 years into the famine. So if you total that all up, it makes Joseph 39. However, there's a few years of context prior to him starting his service with Pharaoh. Chapter 41, verse 46 is referring to when he started working with Pharaoh, having come up from the prison and interpreting Pharaoh's dream. But remember, he spent 2 years being forgotten in prison when, after he resisted Potiphar's wife, her advances, and she lied about him. So it's not a big deal, but he's a couple years older than 39. But it's important to realize how old he is, because remember, his brothers, the last time they saw him, he was 17 years old. So when he reveals himself to them, he no doubt looks a lot different just from age, and also the Egyptian influence and whatever he was wearing, and however they may have decorated, their face or whatever. I don't know all that they do there, but he's certainly, if you don't expect to see someone, think of your high school reunions. The last one I went to was, I think, my 30th or 35th, and people look a lot different, don't they? They've lost their hair, they've put on some weight, maybe a few of them have taken off some weight. But so that's an important point to emphasize just a little bit about how old he is. The main text is, of course, chapter 45, verses 1 through 15, and I think the key verses here are verses 5 through 8. Now, do not be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant in the earth and to keep you alive by great deliverance. Now, therefore, it was not you who sent me here, but God, and he has made me a father to Pharaoh, and Lord of all his household, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. So this is an incredible passage, and the curriculum does a good job. It doesn't really boldly proclaim it as the theme, but it is the theme. They word it this way, right on page 131, right at the beginning of the lesson. It says, acknowledging God's sovereignty helps us seek reconciliation with others. And that definitely is the theme. I word it a little bit differently because I want to get the forgiveness part in there. And so I simply state it this way: trusting God's sovereignty prevents bitterness and leads to a forgiving spirit. The average person, even the average Christian, probably would be really struggling with bitterness after all that's happened to them. But the key to Joseph not doing that is his understanding of God's sovereignty. We often water down God's sovereignty, and there's this incredible balance and give and take in this passage between the human responsibility of what Joseph's brothers did, and yet Joseph saying, you know what, God did this. Notice what it says here. I've highlighted some phrases here. In verse 5, he says, you sold me. And let me not miss this point, the fact that he's revealing himself to them. A couple verses earlier, he says, I'm Joseph. My father's still alive. They're in shock. They're terrified. They're like trying to process all this. And then he says something, verse 5, that proves he's Joseph. He says, you sold me. Nobody else would know about that except for his brothers. And so he says, you sold me here, for God sent me before you. You see the tension? You sold me. God sent me. He doesn't try to water down God's sovereignty. He doesn't dismiss human responsibility. We usually lean on one or the other, and because if they're both equal, it doesn't make sense. Well, when you can have the same mind of God, then you can worry about that. I don't worry about that. It doesn't need to make sense to me. I'm not God. I can't process God fully, and neither can you. So I'm not going to water down God's sovereignty. Chapter 50, verse 20, the key, he's saying it here, but he says it there as well. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. God didn't just make it good. God didn't just permit you to do this, or, this isn't some permissive will thing. God meant this. God meant it for good. Again, huge tension in our minds, but we're not God. Let's go back to the passage. You sold me here, for God sent me. Verse 5. Verse 7, God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant. Verse 8, it was not you who sent me here, but God. Oh, really? It wasn't them? They didn't sell them to the Ishmaelites, and the Ishmaelites they weren't responsible for that? Oh, he's not saying they weren't responsible, but ultimately this was God's plan. And you can, try to water that down. Most people do. I don't. I don't water down the sovereignty of God. Without the sovereignty of God, we have nothing. We have nothing. So that is the key for Joseph not to be bitter, ultimately to see God's plan, God's hand in this. And so when we can do that, we can forgive other people. It's not that we're saying they're not responsible. They are responsible. He tells them they're responsible. But ultimately, he understands that God is sovereign. And so that enables him to be thankful. In everything, give thanks. We talk about that during Thanksgiving time, but how often do we live it? But he's doing that. He's doing exactly that. So when we truly trust God's sovereignty, we're going to be able to resist bitterness and forgive others. And so, key thought, I would challenge your class this way. If you won't forgive others, can you truly say that you're trusting in the sovereignty of God? If you won't forgive someone, can you truly say you're trusting in God's sovereignty? Notice how drastically God is changing all of their circumstances. I mean, they're going from this family in the land of Canaan who is desperate, right? They're suffering this famine just like everyone else. And they're not just, going to Egypt and getting some grain and surviving the famine. God is going to drastically change their circumstances to bring them all to Egypt, put them in the most fertile land that Egypt has to offer, the land of Goshen, verse 10. And then Joseph says, I will provide for you. This is the leader under Pharaoh of Egypt saying, I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to provide for you. What an amazing turnaround in all of their lives. Joseph's had his amazing turnaround. Now they're receiving it. And so one last application question to throw at you to consider using. How does Jacob, and this would be a great discussion question, how does Jacob and Jacob's family's drastic change in circumstances encourage you about your current situation in life? Or the state of our nation, the state of the world? If you're going through difficult times and, of course, you're anxious about the state of this world, think about how quickly and unexpectedly God is drastically changing for the better their circumstances. So we need to trust God. We're in a difficult time of history, but we need to trust God that he will, in his timing, drastically change things, whether it's from his coming, his rapturing us, and in his coming and his kingdom, or revival, or whatever he has planned for for the near future. We can trust God with today, and we can trust God with our future. I hope these things help, and we'll see you on Sunday.